Thank you so much, everybody. I'm excited to be teaching again for my Jewish learning. I apologize that my lighting is a little dark. I recently moved, and this is the first time I tried doing a Zoom from here, and I'm realizing now I need much better lighting. So sorry that I look a little shadowy. But I actually feel like that's fitting for our Masachet that we're going to be kicking off today. So I know we're supposed to do a review of the week in the Daf. I'm really just going to jump in to Masachet Ta'anit, which we started on Sunday this past week. And I would love to hear in the chat how many of you are keeping up with Daf Yomi regularly, or if this is what you're doing once a week. I think one of the things that's great, and I see somebody from Riverdale, Erica Goldman Brody. How are you? So great to see you. And I think one of the things that's great about Daf Yomi is, yes, it has a really kind of intense pace, but since we're learning a daf, you can always jump in or do whatever piece feels good for you. So what I thought I would do is today, I was given a lot of leeway about how to structure this, is I was sort of just going to pick out something that was of interest to me in each of the dafim, basically from daf Bet through Zion of Ta'anit, and discuss it together and sort of try to come up with a little bit of a unifying theme of one thing that I'm starting to see in this Masachet that's really of interest to me. So my podcast that I do daily, which is called Talking Talmud, I'll just plug it for a minute. It's not actually a review of the daf, but it's really me and my chavruta Ann Gordon. We really just talk about what ideas interest us in the daf. And I think that's one of the things that's a little bit hard with Daf Yomi, is that you really could just go through the process and sort of just read it, but you're not necessarily thinking a little bit about what's the daf really trying to teach me, or what am I thinking about here? And so I think one of the things I would encourage everyone to do is, if you are doing daf regularly, is really to sort of keep a notebook, like keep like a little notebook, and write down like a passage that interests you or something like that. So since we're at the beginning of a Masachet, we are just going to start at the beginning of the Masachet. And so what I think I'm going to do is, do people want to see me, or would they prefer if I share my screen with the actual text itself? My Jewish learning, what do you think, Ben? Okay.
I think, why don't we see you, Yardaena? I think people, if they want to, can pull up the.
Okay, great.
Just direct folks.
If you want, this would be my suggestion. Open up to Safaria, and I actually did it through Safaria, so I'll tell you where you can find it in Safaria if you want to be following along. So if you want to open it up on your another screen in Safaria, this way you can follow along, and I'll make sure to say the numbers in English as well. So we're on the first page, what we call Daf Bet Amud Aleph, or page 2A. And first, we're just going to start with the simple Mishnah here. Okay, from what date do we begin to mention the rain? So this is one important thing that this Masachet talks about. This whole Masachet of Ta'anit, right, which literally means to fast, a fast day, is not talking about our typical fast days that we think about, right? The fast days of Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur, but a very specific type of fast day, which is a fast day that occurs when there is no rain in Israel. Now, I'm actually zooming from all of you in Israel. I'm in Modi'in right now, which is where I recently had the merit of making Aliyah exactly 2 months ago. And one of the things here is it actually has not really rained yet. It's supposed to pour tonight. You can smell it outside, actually, but people are starting to get a little bit nervous. And what this Masachet deals with is all of the Jewish laws around what happens when it's not raining. And that basically there's a whole series of special prayers and fast days that basically will occur if we don't get the rain when it's supposed to happen. And so the question here that we start with is, from when do we start mentioning the rain? Not praying for rain or asking or requesting for rain, but mentioning rain. And what we're talking about here is that little line that we insert in the second bracha, in the second paragraph of Shmona Esrei, where we say, Mashiv HaRuach O Morid HaGasham, right? He who brings the wind and the rain, right? Talking about God there. Now, I just want to ask this, does this Mishnah remind anybody of another very famous Mishnah? If you've been learning Daf Yomi consistently, you can sort of just drop that in the chat, I guess, if this reminds you. Yes, thank you, Michael Asher. Okay, you are correct, right? So this should remind you of the first Mishnah in Brachot, right? When do we say Shema? in the evening prayer. And so we sort of see the same formulation here. And one of the things that's interesting here is the Gemara actually asked that question on this Mishnah, which we'll see in a minute. So Rabbi Eliezer says, Miyom Tov Harishon Shel Chag. So he says from the first day of Sukkot, basically, Chag is always Sukkot, we start to say Mashi Baruch Morid Hagashem. Rabbi Yeshua Mer Miyom Tov Ha'acharon Shel Chag. And Rabbi Yeshua says, nope, we start saying it from the last day of Chag, from the last day of the festival of Sukkot. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, so Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Eliezer, Ho'ol ve'ena geshamim ela siman klalal b'chag. Right, since we know that if it actually rains on Sukkot, it's considered to be a curse. It's a sign of a curse. Now, I don't know if anybody's actually been in Israel. There was one year I was in Israel, probably was already about 10 years ago, and there was a crazy rainstorm on Sukkot, and everybody's sukkah got destroyed from the first night of Sukkot to the first day of Sukkot. And people were very upset about it. It's really considered to be not a good thing. And there's sort of this sense of unease because a lot of the sukkahs actually became not kosher over the night because the schach blew down or somebody's wall was destroyed or something like that. So Rabbi Yeshua's point is, Lama hu maskir. If rain is not a good thing over Sukkot, Rabbi Eliezer, why would you start to say, mention the rain, Mashi Baruch Morid Hagashem on Sukkot itself? Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Afani lo amarti lisho ela lasker. He says, no. He's like, hold on, Rabbi Yeshua. I'm not saying that we request it. We're not praying for it. What I'm saying is that we are just mentioning it. It's just a mention. It's a maskir, right? The same way that we mention Yetziat Mitzrayim every day in the Shema, right? The Exodus from Egypt. He's saying this is just a mention, right? Mashiva Ruach, right? So he says, right? Ela laskir Mashiva Ruach Morid Hagashem be'onato. Right, so we're just going to mention it, sort of in its time, because it's starting to be the time of the rain. So then Rabbi Yeshua says, okay, then we should always say Mashi Baruch Morid Hagashem, right? Even in the summer, because it always can rain. And so then he replies, Ein sholim et geshamim ela samuch legeshamim. He says, no, we're only going to mention rain really next to the rainy period. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ha'over lifnei hateva b'yom ha'acharon shel Chag. Ha'acharon maskir, harishon eno maskir. So then they move on to the next discussion here, which is who actually is the first person to say Mashi Baruch o Morid Hagashem, right? What happens on those days of Chag, where we're going to have a shacharit prayer, right, a morning prayer, and a musaf prayer? When is it that we make the actual switch itself to inserting Mashi Baruch o Morid Hagashem? Again, I'm looking at myself in the camera, and I really apologize. Such a dark room. So you'll have to invite me back now and I can have better lighting so you guys can actually see my face. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda says here, over lifnei hateva, b'yom tov ha'acharon shel ha'chag, ha'acharon maskir. So Rabbi Yehuda says, ha'over lifnei hateva, right, which literally means one who passes before the ark, but that's always the euphemism used for the shliach tzibor, for the person who leads the prayers, right? So if it's on the last day of Chag, okay, we're talking about the 8th day with the Shmini Atzeret, we say it at the Musaf prayer, the Acharon, the last person to daven. Harishon eno maskir, the person who is leading Shacharit would not say it. B'yom tov harishon shel Pesach, right? And then when do we end Mashi Baruch Morid Hagashem? On Pesach. So the person in the morning, the person who says Shacharis on the first day of Pesach, Harishon maskir, ha'acharon eno maskir. And the last person does it. Now, I think that sort of makes sense because if you think about it, the Musaf prayer is sort of the prayer that signifies what's special about the day. Yes, we'll mention in Shacharit on both of those Yom Tov days that it is Chag, but it's really the Musaf that is this sort of additional prayer that recognizes what's special, what korban, what sacrifice should have been brought in the Beit Mikdash. And so I think it makes sense, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion here, that sort of it's the Musaf person, that's where you're going to see that change, whether it's Shmini Atzeret for beginning to say Mashi Baruch Morid Hagashem, or whether it's going to be on the first day of Pesach when we're going to stop saying Mashi Baruch Morid Hagashem. And then the Gemara goes on to ask a question, which was sort of what I asked before. So he says, okay, where does the Tana stand literally mean? Sort of like that he teaches from when. In other words, what's confusing here is that it seems like it's already been established that there's an obligation to be maskir the rain. So you're already jumping into me'ematai. How do we even know that you have to mention rain at all? Tana hatam kai. So it says, okay, it says, yeah, the Tana mentioned that. He taught that. That was actually a Mishnah in Masachet Brachot, right? And now they're going to quote it, and it's a Mishnah that appears on page 33a of Brachot, Tiketani, right? As we learned in a Mishnah, Maskirim Geburot Geshamim B'Tchiyat HaMeitim. We remember, right, rains in the prayer, in the bracha, right? This is the second bracha of Shemona Esrei, of the resurrection of the dead, of Tchiyat HaMeitim. The Shoalin B'Verchat HaShanim. And we requested, right, in the bracha of Verchat HaShanim, which is where we say, Utein Tal Matar Livracha. The Havdalah B'Chonein Hadad. And the Havdalah prayer that we say, right, at the end of Shabbat, right, when we say Mariv on Saturday night, that's in the bracha of Chonein Hadad, right? And then we also have the Kitani, right? There's as well, the Mishnah teaches, Me'ematai Maskirin Gevurot Geshamim. So since in that Mishnah and Brachot, right, it establishes that we have to say Gevurot Geshamim all, that we have to mention the rain at all. So then this Mishnah teaches, from when do we say it? So then the Gemara asks a great question. The Litnei Hatan, okay, teach it over there in Brachot. Why are we teaching it over here in its own Masachet Ta'anit? Ma'ishnat Deshtavke Ad Hacha. Right? What's different about it that it left it to over here towards the end, basically, of Moed, if you think about it, of whole of Seder Moed? Why isn't it in Brachot? Ella, Tana me Rosh Hashanah Selig. So it says, no, the Tana is really interrupting a discussion that takes place from Masachet Rosh Hashanah, which was just the previous tractate that we had. Ditnan, we learned in a Mishnah there, Ubechag Nidonin al Hamayim, right, on Sukkot, the judgment is given out for the year on what type of water we'll get, how much it's going to rain. That judgment takes place on Sukkot. And since the Tana taught, right, in Rosh Hashanah, there was a Mishnah there that taught that on the festival of Sukkot, everybody's judged for water. So here we have Ta'anit comes next as a Masachet, and here we teach about when do we start to mention it, right? So then, so it's interesting to see this because what I love about this passage is it's very meta of the Gemara, right? It's meta for the Gemara to sort of really think about its internal structure as Mishnah. And that's not something that we often see them reflect on. And here, this Gemara is really showing us that there is really, sort of the Gemara assumes that there is actually an internal structure to the Mishnah itself, and that where Mishnayos was placed was actually very deliberate. Sometimes when we learn Mishnah, you'll read it and you'll be like, I don't know where they got in this topic. It seems a little bit off, or something was mentioned in one Mishnah and then they'll get on for the next four Mishnahs, sort of like a tangent topic that doesn't really relate to the entire Masachet theme. But here we really see the Gemara reflect on that there seems to be this very core and well thought out, deliberate structure. And I started doing Daf Yomi with this cycle, and I can't recall yet seeing a Gemara passage that sort of reflects so deliberately or sort of argues that there's such a deliberate structure for the Mishnah itself. So I think that's why this passage is really particularly interesting. So Hannah Kaufman just wrote here, right, that it's trying to make an order in chaos. Yeah, the Mishnah tends to seem a little bit more chaotic, and here it seems to be, a little bit more, here they seem to want to have a little bit more order here. Okay, so that is what I wanted to mention in Bet. So now we're going to skip down to the third page of Ta'anit. And if you're following with me in Sefaria, on page 3A, you can go down to section 13, okay? That's where I'm gonna start reading from section 13, okay? And so here, the Gemara gets into, section 12. So one of the things that's been very striking, Carol Friedman, you have a question here. I guess you can unmute yourself. Can people unmute?
Go ahead, Carol, if you want to unmute yourself, you can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Carol.
Hello? Oh, okay. I was just wondering if you could explain the time gap between when the Gemara was written and the ordering of the Masachet. And the, when you talked about it being meta, I wasn't aware that the rabbis who were engaged in these disputes were alive at the time the Talmud had been put together, edited?
That's a great question. So what we tend to say, let's say the traditional answer is that, you know, the period of the Tanaim, let's say, starts from around a little bit before, let's say 0, okay? I'm giving the English dating. And then it sort of ends with the period of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, right? Judah the Prince, who we say redacted the Mishnah. That in other words, it's sort of, there's this period of 200 years of the Tanaim. We say usually there's about 5 generations of Tanaim. And, you know, there's a lot of Tanaitic literature that sort of gets put out, which could be Mishnah, which could be something that we call Tosefta, which could be something that's called Brisa. There's also Midrash Halacha. I guess my Jewish learning, I'm happy to come back and do a little bit of a review of all of that, because I think that's actually a really important thing to understand. But what we credit Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi for doing is for sort of bringing all of it together in the form of Mishnah as we have it. And actually what I would encourage everybody to do is, if you look on Daf, I believe it's Daf Chet of this Masachet, either Daf Chet or Tet. I'm pretty sure it's Chet. It's Chet. At the beginning of Daf Chet, Amud Aleph, on page 8a, at the top, there's a beautiful passage with Reish Lakish, who is a first generation Amora, right? Those are the writers of the Gemara. And he basically talks about how important it is to actually commit Mishnah to memory. So the thing about Mishnah is that it probably was, it's oral, right? It's the write down of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and there's been some academic work done that sort of thinks a little bit about like, how did they commit it, right? To actually commit it to memory. It probably was something that you memorized. Think about their short snippets. Very often it's lists of 3, for example, which is very much an oral tradition that found in other cultures as well, right? Like memorizing list of 3s is very easy to remember. And a couple of other things that show that really these were things that were supposed to be memorized. So there is a tradition, Carol, I guess this was my long-winded answer here, that the Mishnah does have some sort of internal structure that is from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. However, we will see many, passages in the Gemara often where sometimes they'll be questioning how to understand a particular Mishnah, right? Like they'll say like, this Mishnah doesn't really make sense because we have a Brisa that says this and they seem to contradict each other. And the Gemara will be as bold to say, you know what, there's words missing from this Mishnah, or this Mishnah really should be read differently, or you need to edit that Mishnah differently. So when you see those Gemaras, that sort of seems to apply that the Amoraim, right, which is the generation after the Tanaim, almost in a way we're still editing the Mishnah. So I agree with you. I think that it's not completely clear cut. Here, we just read a passage today that seems to very strongly speak of sort of this internal fixed structure of the Mishnah. But we have plenty of passages in the Gemara that the Amoraim felt very differently about it, that there sometimes did need to be some tweaking, editing to the Mishnah. And that's more towards the language of a specific Mishnah, not necessarily to the order. But I think that's a really important question, Carol. And one that I obviously could spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about. So hopefully we'll have another opportunity to think about that together again. So now we're going to go to the 3rd page of Ta'anit. And again, if you're following along in Safaria, we are on 3A, okay? 3A, section 12. And so one of the things that I've been very struck by so far in this Masachet is that a lot of what this Masachet is dealing with is it's thinking about rain and how does rain function in the world? How is it brought in the world? And that there seems to be this connection between something that we think of as really being part of the natural world, right? Like all of us could read an article, maybe some of us better, maybe there's a meteorologist learning with us now, who really understands like how rain comes about, right? That whole process of, I'm like now thinking of 8th grade science, like condensation, right? And how the rain goes up and a cloud forms. But this Gemara, this whole Masachet turns it on its head. Because what this Masachet does is it basically says something that we sort of think of as part of the natural order of the world actually is completely dependent on our relationship with God and whether or not God is happy with us or not happy with us. And that's not really a way that we often think about our relationship with the natural world. And I think that's something to me that is most striking about this particular Masechta. And so a lot of what this, and it's really only with rain in particular. It's something specific with rain. Now, where does that come from about the rain? We say that, every day when we say Shema, right? If you look in the second paragraph of Shema, that whole, right, V'hayayim shamoa, that whole paragraph is basically, a paragraph talking about our relationship with rain, right? The first paragraph, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, is about our devotion to God. The second paragraph is basically saying, once we live in Eretz Israel, once we live in the land of Israel, what is the outward symbol of whether or not we're in a good groove with God is whether or not we're getting rain. And if we do the mitzvot, if we follow God's will, then we're going to get rain. And when we don't get it. And I want everyone to really sit with that a little bit, because that is so not how we think about the world. I'm assuming most of us here are, very much sort of, I'm a doctor actually in my real life. So, we're like people of science. We sort of believe in the natural world. And for me, at least, I think what I'm grappling with is that this Masechet is sort of like turning that all on its head. Like, yes, there are laws of nature, but at the end of the day, rain in particular is symbolic of the special relationship that we have with God. So that's kind of just what I want to set up here a little bit. And so one of the things the Gemara does here that's interesting is that it sort of wants to talk about, okay, so we have to mention rain. Why don't we mention other natural things in the world? In other words, there's lots of things that we see. There's wind, there's dew, there's lots of things that happen, okay? What's special about rain in particular? And so they bring up rice here. Tana, batal ubirucho, batal ubirucho, lo chivu chachamim lahaskir. When it came to dew and wind, the sages did not obligate one to mention it, right? The same way that we have to say mashi v'ruach or morid hagashan. Sometimes in the summer, there are some people say mashi v'ruach, right? Who brings the wind, umorid hatal, and who has the dew fall. We're not obligated to say that. If you forget to say that in your private Shmona Esrei, you don't actually have to go back and repeat Shmona Esrei again, right? And so the question is, why is that, right? If it's important to mention Geshem, right? Why don't we have to mention Tal? So it says, my taima, what's the reason? Amar Rabbi Chanina, right? Rabbi Chanina says, Lefi she'ein atzrin, right? Because winds and dew are basically, what the Gemara is saying is, are consistent and are not withheld. And so what the Gemara is really saying very explicitly here is, rain is something that can be withheld. God withholds rain. But when it comes to some of these other things in our natural world, like wind and dew, those things are not withheld. Now, the commentators discuss why is that. And the explanation that they basically give is because the world couldn't function without dew or with rain, with wind, whereas we know that rain, right, because we know it does happen, we can function without that. But I think this is a very key passage to this entire Masechet, right? This is sort of the key thing that it's setting up for Tractate Ta'anit, right? Lefi she'ein na'atzrin, right? So the implicit thing here is that Geshem is na'atzar. Geshem, rain, is something that God will regularly withhold. And so from there, the Gemara goes on to quote a few psukim to basically explain, how do we know that dew is never withheld? How do we know that that winds are never withheld? I'm not going to read those psukim just for the sake of time. So again, I think this to me is like a very key passage with the entire meaning of Ta'anit. Okay, now if you go to 3b, section 5, I'm going to skip down a little bit here, and then they go to the next natural thing in the world. Tana, now we have another brisa. With regards to clouds and wind, right? Also the Chachamim, also Chazal, the sages, did not require us to mention it. But in this case, if you want to mention it, you can mention it. My taima, what's the reason? And again, mishum zelo ma'atzrei, because again, clouds, okay, and wind are not something that are ever withheld. And then again, the Gemara goes through a series of psukim to basically prove, how do we know from the description of clouds and wind in Tanakh, right, in the Bible itself, that these are things that are not withheld. So again, I think what we can learn here from this third daf is, basically this idea that there is something unique about rain, that rain does not really operate under our own natural principles. And I guess my question is, to people of faith like we are, right? Modern people of faith, do we really believe this? Like, how do we really believe this in practice? You know, I think if we really think about this, this is sort of an opportunity for us to sort of, I guess, have to declare our faith a little bit more than our belief in science. You know, very often I think we figure out a way to function, you know, our belief in the natural world and science and our belief in the spiritual domain. And I think this Gemara and this Masachet is in a little bit in the way forcing us as modern learners to sort of challenge some of those notions, where it very explicitly says that, you know, unlike the other things, tal, ruach, clouds, right, dew, wind, and clouds, those are never going to be withheld, but rain is going to be withheld. And, you know, often we may read passages in the Gemara that try to explain science, like when we get to Seder Nashim, to, you know, all the laws of women, and there's a lot of, particularly in Nida, right, the Masachet that deals with some of the laws of menstruation and family purity, you know, there is some understanding about how a woman's body works that today we know is not really how it works. And certainly there are some religious groups in Judaism who want to say, like, no, the science is as the Gemara presents it. But I think here, you know, for us modern learners, we have an opportunity and a challenge here to think a little bit more about, you know, what is our relationship between God, the natural world, and how we understand the world around us. And again, for me personally, this Masachet, I think, is challenging me to really think about some of this spiritual connection that there actually is within nature, that there is within nature itself. So just a couple of comments here that I think are interesting here. So Nancy wrote here, living in the Sonoran Desert gives opportunity to celebrate the when and how of dew, drizzle, and rain. Dita wrote here that these are all good arguments to work to mitigate climate change. I agree. I think there's something to be said about that. And then Rob Flash shared here, uttering the seasonal phrases are meaningful to many people as a means to perpetuate traditions. Okay, so I guess, Rob, you're of the opinion that, like, maybe you don't necessarily buy into the spiritual connection, but the minhag of it, or maybe the reminder of how powerful God is very important. But I think we're going to see how even more so that this argument is made later on in a few other pages. So now we're going to jump down to the 4th page, okay? And if you're on 4A, okay, please go to section 4A4, okay? And this sort of is not going to deal with the natural, we'll get back to the natural piece of rain here and how it fits in, but this is just a very interesting passage that I wanted to share here. Sorry, a few more things about the seasons here. Susan shared it's a recognition of the moving of the seasons. And Barbara says, you know, an ecological spin. Are we in our actions using our free will to upset the rains, both droughts, drenches, and floods? And so I think that's a very interesting thing, because we'll see on page 6, on page 7 and page 6, there's a discussion about what sins actually cause rain to be withheld. And so I think that's, you know, that piece is very interesting. Okay, so now let's go to page 4. So page 4 has this very interesting tangent here. And it says the following, Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So again, we're on page 4A, section 4. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said, Rabbi Yonatan taught the following, Shlosha sha'alu shelo kahogen, lishnayim hishivu kahogen, le'echad hishivu shelo kahogen. Eluhain Eliezer Eved Abraham, v'Shaul ben Kish, v'Yiftach Hagiladi. So what the teaching here is of Rabbi Yonatan is the following. There are 3 people in the Bible who basically asked something in an inappropriate way, and we'll go through the details of what that was. 2 of them were answered favorably. In other words, even though they didn't ask the right way, God still answered them the way that they wanted to be answered. 1 of them was asked unreasonably and was answered unreasonably. And who are those 3 people? Right? Eliezer Eved Abraham, right? The servant of Abraham when he goes to find Rivka, right? Shaul ben Kish, the king Shaul, and Yiftach Hagiladi in the story of Jephthah, okay? And so now the Gemara goes into what exactly happened here. Eliezer Eved Abraham, Dichtiv, right? Eliezer, the son of Abraham, right? Because it taught, So I actually think for time's sake, I'm gonna like skip through this a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna go for a full hour. There seems to have been a little bit of a mix up with the time. Whoever wants to stay, please stay with us. And next time we'll get it sorted out if this is supposed to be a half hour or an hour. So apologies about that. So if you look at the rest of that passage there, I'm not gonna read it all inside just for the sake of time. So the story of Eliezer is that basically when Eliezer, now I want to point something out. It's interesting the Gemara calls him Eliezer because if you look in that story itself, it's chapter 24 in Genesis, okay? The name Eliezer does not actually appear. The servant is only referred to as Eved Avraham. And this is a great example of where the Gemara, the sages always have a tendency, they want to collapse the number of people who are actually in the Bible. The name Eliezer only appears in the Brit Bein Habitarim, right? The famous Brit, why am I blanking on the English word for Brit? The famous Brit that God makes with Abraham, right? Where he cuts up the animals. And one of the things that Abraham says to God is he says, I don't have an heir, is Eliezer, like who my servant, is he going to be my heir? And then based on that, when this Eved is mentioned without the name Eliezer, the sages come and they say Eliezer. So I just want to point that out, that the Gemara is calling Eliezer, but the name Eliezer does not actually appear in chapter 24. So when Eliezer goes to basically ask that, you know, he should find a wife for Yitzchak, right? The Pasuk says, and this is in Genesis chapter 24, verse 14, right? That the first woman who comes to him, first maiden who comes to him and says, please let down your pitcher, right? And, you know, so that I can drink, and he'll give her this, you know, give Eved Avraham water, right? That this will be the person that Yitzchak's supposed to marry. And so the Gemara basically says, well, what if, you know, the person was somebody who was blind or somebody who had a physical disability? Now, this is totally not a PC Gemara. We could spend a lot of time talking about this. I'm a little uncomfortable with this Gemara. But the point is that the Eved Avraham didn't make any qualifications about what this type of person was supposed to be, who Rivka was supposed to be. And yet, even though he asked inappropriately, God still sent Rivka. Then we get to the story of Shaul, which again, the Gemara goes through in detail here on this page, which talks about that basically Shaul wanted to be saved from the Philistines, specifically from Goliath. And basically, he makes an offer, right, that it says whoever kills Goliath, this is in Samuel 1, chapter 17, verse 25. He basically says, whoever kills Goliath, the king will enrich him and will give him my daughter. Now, again, the Gemara comments, not an appropriate vow, because what if a slave, right? What if a slave killed Goliath? Or what if a mamzer, right? The category of a Jewish bastard who sort of came out of an incestuous relationship, okay? What if that's the person who killed Goliath? Would the king's daughter really mean that, marry that person? Now we know what happened. It's David who kills Goliath, right? Who kills Goliath, and David marries Michal. So in other words, Saul asked for something in an inappropriate way, but God still answers him appropriately. And then finally, the last passage is one about Yiftach, right? About the famous story of Jephthah's daughter, right? That Jephthah says basically, whoever comes from my house first, this is in Judges chapter 11, verse 31. Again, this is all written down in the Gemara, I'm just not reading it inside, right? I will sacrifice to God. And it's interesting here the Gemara says, Yachol afilu davar tameh. Let's say something impure came out of his house, right? So what would he have done? Like a non-kosher animal, he would have sacrificed it. And instead, what happens? Gon lo again, shibuk shaloka again. He gets answered unreasonably, nistama lo bito. And what happens? His daughter is who comes out, and he has to dedicate his daughter to God. And then the Gemara, so one thing that I find very interesting about this is that these are all stories that involve women, right? And some piece of like women in a way, like having agency or not having agency, right? The idea that like Rivka, right? Whoever this maiden was who came to him was automatically going to want to marry Yitzchak. The idea that whoever killed Goliath, right? Who carried Goliath automatically was going to marry the king's daughter. And then finally that with Jephthah's daughter, right? That whatever, that Yiftach sort of without his daughter's knowledge ends up sort of dedicating her to God. So, I don't know that I always ascribe to sort of doing sort of modern feminist readings to the Gemara, but this passage to me I was like, how can you not give a feminist reading to it? It's just so striking to me that these three passages all affect a woman's fate, and all are examples where women actually, at the end of the day, do not actually have agency over their fate. So that was very interesting to me. And then finally, what's interesting here is that the second part of the Gemara is they go into the following. So then the Gemara is going to say that, okay, so now we talked about, these three stories, okay, and now we're going to do two stories of where Knesset Yisrael, right, where the congregation of Israel also didn't request something appropriate from God. Amar Rabbi Barchia. So now I'm on section 10 on page 4a of Ta'anit, okay? And it says the following: Av Knesset Yisrael Sha'ala Shelo Kalgan. Even the congregation of Israel, asked something or begged of something from God unreasonably. V'Hakadosh Baruch Hu Heshivan Kalgan. But yet God still answered them reasonably. Shenamar. So here's the pasuk. It's a verse from Hosea chapter 6, verse 3 that says, "V'neidad nirdefa ladad et Hashem kishachar nachon motza v'yabo kageshem." So what it says is, and let us know, meaning this is the voice of Israel speaking, eagerly strive to know the Lord. He is going forth as sure as the morning, and he will come to us as the rain. So in other words, they compare having some sort of revelation with God as to the rain. Amar la HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Notice what's interesting here is, we just have these three stories with women. In Israel is addressed in the feminine, right? Amar la. God says the following: BT, my daughter. Okay, so again, very interesting, because these three stories were primarily stories of daughters, right? Rivka being the daughter of Lot, Michal being the daughter of Shaul, and Jephthah's daughter being his daughter, right? And so now we have the same language here. BT, right? You asked of something, rain, that sometimes is desired and sometimes is not desired. But I, God, will always be something for you that is desired. Shene'emar, and so here they quote a pasuk from a verse from Hosea, chapter 14, verse 6, Ehyeh katal Yisrael. I will be like dew to Israel, right? Because dew is always considered to be a blessing, not like rain. V'od shalash shelo again, and here's the second time that the congregation of Israel asked something that was not reasonable. Amar lefanav, right? They said, Ribono Shalom, Master of the Universe, and now they quote a verse from Song of Songs from Shir Hashirim, chapter 8, verse 6. Simeni kachotem alibe kachotem al za'orech. Set me a seal upon your heart, a seal upon your arm. So it's talking about that Israel should be like a seal on God's heart or God's arm. Amar la HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and again, the same feminine language. God says, BT, my daughter, right? You ask for something for this seal to be in a place that's sometimes seen, right? The place of the heart is hidden, and an arm can sometimes be hidden. But I will make sure, right? I will manifest myself in a way that it's always visible. Shenamar, and here they quote a pasuk from Isaiah, chapter 49, verse 16. Hein al kapayim chakotich, right? I will have engraved you on the palm of God's hand, right? You can always see a palm. A palm is not typically covered up. And so I just think the literary piece of this whole passage is very, very interesting. It's interesting to think about that it's sort of on the backs of women that these three inappropriate requests happen. Somebody here just wrote to me that this, Erica just shared that this passage from Shir Hashirim was part of her, is on wedding band. That's beautiful. And then it follows with sort of this exchange between God and the congregation of Israel, but notice that it's the congregation of Israel as a bat, as a daughter. And so I almost feel like, in a way, what these passages are coming to do is like, yes, man sometimes makes the mistake of not treating their daughters correctly, but I, God, I will always treat my daughter correctly. And that in a way, it's actually sort of fixing, what the mistakes were of Eved Abraham, King Saul, and of Yiftach and of Jephthah. So I think this is a very, very interesting passage. Okay, The double S symbol in Sefaria, it just means it's moving on to like a new section. That's what that symbol means. Okay, now we're going to move to page 5. So page 5, we have the second Mishnah of this parak. And if you look at, go to page 5b, page 5a, section 11. Okay, I got to scroll down also. Oh, thank you, Rob. Yes, it means section. I never thought of that before. Okay, wait, I'm just trying to find the Mishnah on this page. Okay, where is the Mishnah on this page? I wrote down the wrong section here. Hold on. Let me find it. Okay, notes were good, but I guess not that good. I wrote something down wrong here. Oh, it's section 3. Thank you. On 5A, Dee says it's section 3 on 5A. Okay, section 3 on 5A. Okay, I wrote something messy here and I missed here what I meant to write. Okay, so now we have the second Mishnah here, right? Ad matai sho'alin geshamim. Until when do we ask? So in other words, the asking is not the Mashiv Harocha Morida Gashem, but what we say later on in the Shemona Esrei, right? The Tain Tal Umatar Libracha, right? That dew should be given, the rain should be given for a blessing. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ad Pesach. So Rabbi Yehuda says we say it until Pesach passes, right? Rabbi Meir Omer Ad Sheyetzei Nisan. Rabbi Meir says no, we say it for the whole rest of the month of Nisan. Shenamar Vayared Lachem Geshem Oret Umakosh Banisan. Because there's a verse in Joel, right? Chapter 2, verse 23, which says, God causes to come down for you the rain, the first rain and the last rain in the first month. So it seems to say that it rains all through Nisan itself. And so from there, the Gemara gets into a discussion about the Yoret and the Malkosh. And that's the next thing that I really want to talk about here is what is Yoret and what is Malkosh? And one of the things that we see that's interesting here is that besides the fact that rain seems to be somewhat supernatural, right? That it's something that God will specifically sort of stop. It's also that we have different names for rain here, okay? That we don't just call it rain. I don't think in the English language, yes, we have like thunderstorm, dew, and rain, but here we have different Hebrew words for when the rain actually falls. And so I think this also shows how special the relationship is between us and rain itself. So now we're gonna hop down to page 6, okay? Go to page 6A, section 6. Okay, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. What is the Yoret and what is the Malkosh that was mentioned here in the Mishnah? So it reads as follows here. Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brisa. Yoret, okay? The Yoret is what we call the first rain. Okay, that is the first rain that we're still waiting for in Israel to really happen. Shemoret et habriot lahatia gagotehan. So why is it called Yoret, right? So it's called that because Shemoret, it instructs, right? That's the idea of Yoret. It teaches, instructs the people basically to plaster their roofs, right? Ulahaknias perotam, to bring in their fruits, the lasot kol tzarchan, and to do everything they need to do to get ready for the winter. So the idea of Yoret is that once you get that first rain, okay, in Cheshvan, usually it's supposed to be the month after Chagim, that then everybody knows, okay, I quickly have to go get ready for the winter. And so that's what they do. Right? Another idea is that it's marveh, it moistens the earth and it waters it to its depth. And how do they know this? Here they quote a pasuk from Psalms chapter 65, verse 11. Talmeha reva nachat gedudeha b'revivim tomegena simchat tevarech, right? Which says watering the rivave, right? That's the same word of Yoreh, the same shorish of resh vav he, right? Watering its ridges abundantly, settling down its furrows. You make it soft with showers, who bless its growth. Davar acher, and finally gives a third explanation, Yoreh, sheyored v'nachat ve'eno yored b'za'at. That this Yoreh, this first rain, falls gently and does not fall harshly, doesn't fall with a lot of force. Okay? Now, the Gemara says, okay, you seem to be saying that Yoreh always has to be something good. Oh, Eino Yoreh, Ela Shemashira Tapeirot. So they say, maybe this isn't the case. Maybe Yoreh is the rain that causes the fruit to drop from the trees. Umashtifat Zra'im, or maybe it washes away seeds that were planted. Umashtifat Ilanot, or it washes away the trees, right? In other words, how can you say that the first rain is always a blessing? Maybe this Yoreh can actually be destructive sometimes. Talmud Lamar, Malkosh. Nope, the Talmud says that we also have the word Malkosh. Now, where do we have the word Malkosh? Sorry, I meant to say this at the beginning. What they're really talking about here is this pasuk from Devarim, from Deuteronomy, chapter 11, verse 14, right? That says, I'm just looking up quickly, that says, oops, sorry, one second. Right, that says, "V'natata mitarza chem bi'ito," right? I will give rain for your land in seasoning, right? We say this in Shema. Yoreh u'malkosh, the early rain and the late rain, right? V'asafta deganacha v'tiroshcha v'yitzaracha, and then you will be able to gather your new grain, wine, and oil. So the words Yoreh and malkosh appear together in this verse in Devarim. This is one of these great passages where the Gemara is talking about something that it doesn't really tell you what it's talking about, that it's referring to this passage in Devarim without actually ever quoting the actual passage itself. And I myself made the same mistake as well when I started teaching it. So they basically say, okay, we know that Yoreh has to be a blessing because it appears in the same verse as Malkosh. Ma Malkosh levracha, af Yoreh levracha. Just as Malkosh, the last rain, always is a blessing, so too Yoreh always has to be a blessing. Oh, eno Malkosh elashem al piel tapatim umishaberet ilanot umalet sakim. So then the Gemara says, how do you know Malkosh is always a blessing? Maybe it isn't a blessing too. Maybe it's what knocks down houses or destroys trees, right? Or brings up locusts. Talmud Lomar, Yoreh. No, it appears in the same pasuk as Yoreh, as the first rain. So it's sort of like a circular, right, logic here. Ma Yoreh livracha, af Malkush livracha. Just like the first rain has to be for blessing, so too the Malkush needs to be for blessing. So then it says, V'yoreh gufei minalan. Okay, so where do we really know that Yoreh is a blessing? Dichtiv, and here they quote a pasuk from Yoel, from verse 2, verse 23, which was the same pasuk that was quoted in our Mishnah. Dichtiv, uvenei Tzion gilu, v'simchu b'Hashem Elokechem, ki natan lachem et hamoreh litzdaka, v'yored lachem geshem moreh u'malkush barishon. Right, because it says, you children of Zion, be glad and rejoice in the Lord your God, for God has given you the first rain, the moreh, in his kindness, and he caused to come down for you the rain, the first rain, the moreh, and the last rain, the malkosh, in the first month. So here it's very clear that the yoreh and the malkosh always is a source of blessing. And so that's how they ultimately learn that yoreh and malkosh, the first rain and the last rain, always have to be a source of blessing. And then we'll just skip the next section here. We'll skip section 5. And just go to section 6, where they want to explain what is the meaning of the word malkosh. Malkosh, what does that mean? So what the Gemara does here is something very interesting. We're going to split the word into two, the word mal and the word kosh, and they make it sort of bring it together to give it 3 different meanings. Amar Rav Nihilai bar Idi, Amar Shmuel. So Rav Nihilai bar Idi says in the name of Shmuel, Dabar shemal, right, from malkosh, kishutehan, right, the kosh, Shel Yisrael, right? So the malkosh is something that circumcises, that mals, it cuts off the stubbornness of the Jewish people. So what the commentators explain here is that if rain doesn't fall in its time, right, that people turn to God and pray. So if the malkosh doesn't come, if that last rain doesn't come, it's going to cause people to repent. So it softens the Jewish people's heart, right? Devei Rabbi Yishmael Tana, the house of Rabbi Yishmael Tana, Davar Shemimale, right, that's the mal, Tivu'ah b'kasheha, right? The last rain is called malkosh because it fills out, mal memale, the produce in its stock, right? The kasheha. B'matnina tani, and then it's taught in a brisa. Here's the third option. Okay, sorry, we are in 6a, section 6, okay? Davar sheyored al mimilut va'al kashin, right? Malkosh is a matter that comes down to the ears, the mimilut, again, you have that word mal there, and now the stalks of kashin. So this, page 6 is very, very interesting. Here we see this concept of there being the first rain and the last rain, the yoreh and the malkosh. Both of them are given 3 explanations for what it actually means, okay? three different understandings of how do they get that word itself. Why is it called Yorah? Why is it called Malkosh? And also that the Gemara's ultimate understanding is whenever Yorah and Malkosh fall, it always has to be for a blessing. So yes, we saw on page 3 that rain is something that God can withhold, but yet at the same time, that first rain and that last rain was always going to be something that is for a blessing. And finally, I want to go to this last page, okay, is we're going to go to page 7. And this is again going to get into this idea of how supernatural rain actually is. And so if you go to first 7a, section 2, so what the Gemara does here is it gives 4 examples of comparing rain to something that is supernatural. And it even goes as far to say that rain is even greater than this supernatural event. It's really a pretty mind-blowing Gemara if we think about it, but I think it emphasizes sort of this special relationship of how special Geshamim, how special the blessing of rain is. So again, we're in Ta'anit 7a, section 2. Amar Rabbi Avahu, let's see if we can finish in our 5 minutes. Rabbi Avahu says, Gadol Yom HaGeshamim Mitzichiyat HaMeitim. Okay, the day of rain is greater than the resurrection of the dead. I mean, just think about what this passage is saying, right? The resurrection of the dead, right? I'm sure all of us have had loved ones that we, in our heart of hearts, hope maybe there will be a resurrection of the dead and we'll actually be, reunited with people again, right? But that rain is more powerful than that day. The miracle of that is right. Now, yes, Tita, you are correct, right? Rain is life. And that I think is partly, and we're going to see all of these examples are things, supernatural things that are symbolic of life. So that's exactly what the Gemara is doing here. Who's going to be resurrected from the dead? Just tzaddikim, just righteous people. Right? But the rain happens for good people or happens for bad people, right? When it rains, it's going to rain on a Rasha's house, just as easily it's going to rain on a tzaddik's house. Upligi to Rav Yosef said to Amar Rav Yosef disagrees and he says, he's not willing to say it's better than, it's gadol. He says it's equal to, right? Kibuahu b'tichiyana metim, right? So it's equal to the resurrection of the dead. Next section, next comparison. Amar Rav Yehuda, gadol yom hageshamim ki yom shenina bo Torah, right? The day of rain is better than the day of the giving of the Torah, right? Now, again, Tita, like your comment, I think we can make an argument. Torah is what gives us life. Also, we compare Torah to Mayim, and that actually is on this page. They're going to go to that next. We're not going to read that. Shene'amar, okay, Yarov kamatar lechi. So then they're going to go through a bunch of psukim here. So they're going to go through a bunch of psukim here to prove that point. But again, I wanted to show you that's the second comparison. So the first comparison is to the resurrection of the dead. The second comparison is to the giving of the Torah of it, the giving of the Torah itself, right? And Rava also agrees with that. Rava also says, right, Rava Amer, Yoter miyom shenabo Torah, right? It's greater than the day that Torah is given. Okay, now skip down to, okay, page B, okay, 7B, okay, sorry there. 7B, oh, sorry, I did not write down. 7B, section 6. Okay, 7B, section 6. Okay. Oh, no, wait, sorry, I'm in the wrong section here. Oh, now I lost my place. Okay. Sorry, okay, no, 7B, section 2. Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina, Gadol Yom HaGeshamim K'yom Shenivaru Shamayim Ba'aretz, right? The day of rain is greater than the day of the creation of the world. And again, now they bring some psukim to prove that. But again, it's amazing to see this comparison, right? That we know that for creation to actually start, that was not within nature itself. And yet it's saying that rain coming, right, is even greater than the day of creation. And then finally, the next section, it says, Amar Rav Yoshia, Gadol Yom HaGeshamim Shafil Yeshua Parav Ravabo, right? Rabbi Yoshia says the day of rain is great as rain facilitates salvation, which is fruitful and multiplies on that day. Very interesting language here, pru revu, right? The language of sort of having children, right? The commandment that was given to Adam, right? Pru revu or meluah ta'aretz, right? go out and have children and fill up the land, right? We know that rain is literally what makes things grow. It's what gives vegetation. And so I think what this passage is doing here, these four comparisons that we have here too, resurrection of the dead, the giving of the Torah, creation, and that it brings salvation, is all meant to underscore here how supernatural rain actually is. And so I think as we continue our study of Ta'anit, I think this is the theme that we really all have to keep in mind. When we think about rain, we're not supposed to be thinking about that chart that I referred to at the beginning, that whole cycle of condensation and falling of the rain. I don't remember what the words is. I should have looked it up, right? That's what we're supposed to be remembering. We're not supposed to be remembering in that. It's really rain in the view of this Masachet it's a supernatural occurrence. And when the first rain happens, the Oreh, whether it's the last rain of Malkosh, it's always something that's for blessing. And whether we get rain is really reflective of what our relationship is with God. So I guess I'll end quickly with a short blessing, right? That as we continue in this raining season, my father, Zichrono Livracha, would always say that when you learn something that actually pertains to something that's happening in your life, he always would call that a nes nistar, like a hidden miracle. So to me, it's a hidden miracle that we're learning Masachet Ta'anit during the actual rainy season. So I challenge all of us to really think about it, or bless all of us to have the ability to see the supernatural that's in our life through the expression of the fall of the rain. So thank you so much for everybody learning with me. I had a wonderful time. I can stay on for a few more minutes just to see if there's any questions. And I hope I will have a opportunity to learn with you all again soon.